Good evening. Your Eminence, Reverend Fathers, brothers and sisters in Christ, glory to Jesus Christ. It's a joy to welcome you all, our esteemed rector, the Board of Trustees gathered here together, faculty, students, friends from nearby, and those who are joining us on the live stream this evening for our Founders Day lecture, and this year with a dear friend, Dr. Ryan Sampson Nash. At the beginning of the summer, we wondered, what will it look like at seminary? Each of our seminaries, including those closest by, ours, St. Vladimir's, Holy Cross, had to make difficult decisions in anticipation of the coming school year. How will we educate our students? What will be required of them, given the fact that we are still in the COVID pandemic in some way, shape, or form? And at that time, remember, things changed dramatically and quickly, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. We made our plans as best as we could and took the track that we took. And thank the Lord, here we are. Almost all the seats are full, almost all the professors teaching in classrooms, almost all the students teaching in classrooms, and we do what we can because some people get sick sometimes, and we had to make our adjustments even last week and 2 weeks ago for these purposes. So in an effort to do the best that we can to maintain a positive, healthy environment in terms of our physical bodies and to pursue our theological education in the classrooms and our spiritual life in the churches together, we had to make the decisions that we made. As we began the semester, it dawned on me, although I'm not alone in that the COVID situation is not something that's dying a slow death. Would also be an interesting study just to see that phrase and how it has appeared out in the digital world, because it has come back to me from way outside the seminary, though I used those words only in an email that I sent to the seminary community about this evening. It's okay, because we were intended to send out our invitations, but in the context of all of that, you may know, those who are in the first year know far better than those of us who have been here for a few years that it's a mess in the world with this topic. Still to this present day, including in my own email box related to this very lecture this evening. I would just like to take a moment to share with you why Dr. Nash is here tonight and why I had 2 live stream Ancient Faith interviews with him prior to this, so that you all will know my thought process at least. And for those who are watching, they can also understand, at least from the person who authored those things, why it happened. And then, more importantly, we can hear the words of our esteemed physician and fellow Orthodox Christian who's here to talk to us in what I believe. I think it is also fair to speak for the rector. Our rector believes, and what we at St. Tikhon's believes, is a very sane approach to this question. A well-studied, sane, pious, serious approach to the question of COVID, the vaccines, and how to find some sanity in the world at the moment. It dawned on me at the beginning of the semester that it might be helpful to have a physician who deals with this question every single day in the hospital where he works. You may have heard earlier, you might hear this evening, but I'll share with you, he is in part responsible for the divvying up of limited quantities of respirators in hospitals. When hospitals are overrun with COVID patients who need respirators, and there are, say, 10 respirators and 20 people who need them, Dr. Nash is a part of a team that has to make the crucial and difficult decision, who gets it and why. As a result of his vast experience in that area, not only theoretical but everyday practical, it seemed wise, and because he came here several years ago to give a beautiful talk on the question of human sexuality, and he stood about right here and gave that talk at that time, that becoming a new friend of St. Tikhon Seminary and very competent as a pious Orthodox Christian and a practicing active physician and bioethicist, that it would be a good thing to go on our Ancient Faith studio right down the hallway and sit in a live call-in show, because people will want to ask questions, and so we did. Dr. Nash from Ohio, which is somewhere over there, and me from the little room right over there. We wondered, it was in the middle of the day, Would it last very long? Would anyone call in? How would we deal with those things? We had no idea, but we did a middle-of-the-day show, and the little phone lines were off the hook. You could see it on the little screen. It was quite an amazing thing. We were very grateful for that. We had what I thought was a very good interchange. I asked questions that I had heard in many places to represent them to Dr. Nash, who in turn answered them from a bioethical and medical perspective and an Orthodox Christian perspective, because he is both of those things in one. At the end of that show, by the end of that show, which did have a deadline on the end, not only because Dr. Nash had to go to work, but the seminary has a life too, and the people need to go back to whatever they were doing in the world, there were a number of questions that we couldn't answer. There were also questions that were raised in that particular live call-in show that we wished we could have spent more time with, but time did not suffice. So after that show, Dr. Nash and I corresponded a number of times, and we decided that we thought it would be helpful, perhaps even fruitful, if we did it again. That time, strictly because of scheduling, we were not able to make it a live aired thing. There's no conspiracy in that. There's no closing the world out. There are a limited number of live stream spots because Ancient Faith is limited in when they can do live call-in things. And then when you tie in a very busy physician and the dean of a seminary, you can deal with what you can deal with in a limited way. So we decided to record one instead. So we recorded our second one. We recorded it live. That means we were both there, but no one else was there. And then later on, Ancient Faith Radio put that on the internet, and there it is for everyone to hear if you haven't heard it. I highly recommend it. Not for what I said, but for what Dr. Nash said, and more of which you will hear this evening. There's no more to the story than that. That's what we did, and that's why we did it. Still, it's my strong conviction, and I feel for the third-year students especially, that the world right now, the parishes to which the graduating seniors will go out in not too long distance from now, you are going to face parishes which are dramatically different than the ones you came from. The only people that we can really cling to and ask about that are the ones who spend enough time out in the world to know. They include our rector who visits those parishes, many in a weekend. They include folks who come from outside and live in the outside world. And they include, this year for the first time during COVID, a batch of students, 21, who have come to the seminary who have seen what it's like out there, but we haven't because we've been here the whole time. But I assure you, from the things that I hear, it's an embittered and embattled world, but not just in the world, also in our parishes. You might have heard that there are new missions that have been established just because of masks, on both sides of things, right? There's people leaving certain churches because of vaccines and because of not vaccines. There are people leaving Orthodox parishes because of masks and no masks. It's a different world. Today, as I don't want to say a conclusion to our efforts, because God only knows what's before us in this category, and it is important for us to hear from a very talented, very studied expert. Believe it or not, especially for those who are listening out there are still experts in the world, and we can still trust them. Here is an expert, and I trust him. Here is an expert, and we trust him. We at least speaking from the perspective of the administration. To hear this evening, at least in a third occasion, that the COVID hill is not a gospel hill to die on. In the interchanges that I've had, and forgive the long-winded introduction, I feel it's important because of the folks more for the folks who are watching than you all are who are here. But I have received email after email after email this week like a symphony of craziness with accusations related to all these things, which is partly why I'm laying it out for you right now. But I have tried to respond to a number of them. I have not reached all of them yet, to state that we are convicted, and through what I have learned from a dear and Orthodox Christian physician and bioethicist, that this is not a gospel hill to die on. I don't even think it's a hill to die on personally, but it's definitely not a gospel hill to die on. which means that our parishes should not be divided over these particular topics. And we can rest at ease, especially with the bioethical questions related to the vaccine. I don't want to qualify that because I'm not a physician, but I want to say that I trust our hierarchs who encourage it. I trust my doctor friend who encourages it, and I myself have seen some of the results of that, and not only in the news, but also in our own seminary. Those, largely speaking, who have been vaccinated and who suffered through COVID have not had major dramatic episodes, though they were sick. And largely speaking out there, those who are unvaccinated, of course, you know, many of them suffer tremendously, and you might even hear a couple stories about that tonight. Don't get lost in those details, except to say, if you're going to die on a hill, make sure it's Golgotha. Because if you're dying on any other hill, it's not the hill that the Lord himself died on. And that's the basic fundamental message that I have hoped in the first two talks that we had on the radio, and the one that I hope will help clarify some of those things, especially if any of you has any doubt or concern about that this evening, and a chance to interact with Dr. Nash with some questions and answers at the end. So, having said that, our dear friend Dr. Ryan Sampson Nash, who has come this evening to speak, to give us a word called Healing COVID Divisions on the reality of sin, trust in authority, and the antinomies of the Orthodox ethos, I would like to introduce him in the following way. Dr. Ryan Sampson Nash, MD, MA, is the Hagup Mock John MD Endowed Chair in Medical Ethics and Professionalism and the Director of the Ohio State University Center for Bioethical Humanities. He is also the Director and Associate Professor with tenure in the Division of Bioethics, Department of Biomedical Education and Anatomy in the College of Medicine. He is the chair of the Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center for Ethics Committee. In addition to serving as a healthcare ethics and clinical bioethics advisor and consultant, Dr. Nash continues to be active in palliative care medicine, caring for patients primarily with advanced cancer. Dr. Nash's scholarship focuses on practical, procedural, and policy issues related to medicine, clinical bioethics, and palliative medicine. He also explores ethics foundations at the nexus of medicine, ethics, theology, religion, and culture. He is the grateful husband of Sarah and proud father of 4 daughters. He occasionally helps them run their small farm north of Columbus, Ohio, and perhaps in our refreshment period after, you could ask him about the goats, the chickens, and the great big dogs who are there, which would at least lighten the mood at that particular time. Please welcome our dear friend, Dr. Ryan Sampson Nash.
Your Eminence, Reverend Fathers, students, faculty, it's a joy to be here with you. I wish it could be a joy to speak on this topic, but I grow weary of this topic, and I am sure that you are as well. To those that are listening on the live stream, I fear that you're at a disadvantage. One is that you're not able to ask questions, and 2 is I've been here for a couple of days, and from hearing the questions from seminarians and from faculty, I did what I usually do when I come to St. Tikhon's, and I scrapped my planned lecture in order to try to answer some of those questions. I also hope to not go on too long so that there will be a long time for questions and answers at the end. So I know that we had a session earlier today with the seminarians, and I hope that primed some questions and that you'll be free to ask them. Not that I know the answer to all of the questions, but at least we can try to struggle together towards them. It's customary in medical lectures to first give disclosures to deal with conflicts of interest. Unfortunately, I don't have any. I am fortunate to have an endowed chair, but I really don't receive money from any other group, despite what some Orthodox sites in their lack of Christian charity are trying to say about me. I just assure you that those of you that don't know me, I'm not a shill for the industry. Neither does my position in any way depend on my view of vaccines or anything related to medicine. In fact, the people I work for have great integrity, as do most people in the medical community. They hire me because I help deal with problems every day, and they want my honest, unbridled opinion, and they take it even when we disagree. If I thought that something was wrong with the vaccines, or that there was great COVID skepticism and a great conspiracy to exterminate Orthodox Christians in the world, I would be crying out that. And so I ask for your charity, at least to suspend judgment those who disagree with me, to hear some claims that what I plan to do in this talk is actually not try to convince people to be vaccinated. It's also not to try to convince people not to be vaccinated. My goal, my hope, is for us to try to be charitable towards one another and to think through some of the challenges and why we're in the chaotic mess that we're in as a culture. I don't know if I also am going to do this mainly extemporaneously, jettisoning my talk based on our discussions earlier. So I ask for charity that every word that I say may not be pure, may be tainted by my own fallibility. I may stumble over something, and I ask that the good Lord protect you and your ears from all my errors. May they be blotted out, and may the only things that are profitable be remembered. And I also don't put myself above reproof. If you think I'm in error, please correct me, brothers and sisters, Reverend Fathers. I'm not above reproof. I don't think I have it all figured out, but some things are pretty obvious. So I'm going to go through some glancing, over the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to go through some glancing comments on the current dilemma. But first, again, I don't have any financial disclosures to make. Politically, I'm perpetually disgruntled, as I think most Orthodox should be. So I've worked with on a lot of policy issues. I do a lot of work with groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom and other conservative groups concerned about religious liberty. I helped author a religious liberty in medicine law that's passed in 5 states on conscientious practice and refusal. So I don't want you to think I'm an enemy. I'm not some progressive trying to come and infect you. I am an observant Orthodox Christian. I was baptized in the faith a decade ago in Birmingham, Alabama. I attend an OCA parish in Columbus, Ohio, but I am a sinner. I am not holy. I do not have holy perception and immediate discernment of good and right. I study ethics, I study medicine, and I try to help people struggle. I'm not clergy. I don't have the dignity of any office of the church, nor do I have the authority of any office of the church. I'm not a theologian in any sense of that word, as one who formally studied or writes in theology, or as one who prays truly. So I am a physician. I'm a medical ethicist. I've cared for over 10,000 patients, many of them with terminal illness. I've watched death and had the blessing of having death ever before me, that I can try to order my life accordingly. So I've cared for many patients, and I'm actively engaged in COVID on a daily basis. Father John, we in Ohio, we have not had to make ventilator decisions, thankfully. I am in charge of the Allocation of Scarce Resources Committee for the Ohio State Wexner Medical Center. I'm an advisor for the governor's office on the same, and I am in charge of the committee that would have to make the decision on ventilators. Thankfully, we have enough so far. We've gotten very close to needing to make hard decisions, and I dread, and that is a decision that in fear and trembling I would have to make. I don't want to have to make it. We have a society that expects excellent medical care if you get sick. And one of the reasons COVID has been so scary is because our expectations may not be met, because our health systems don't have the margin that we think they have. We have great technology, but we're not equipped to handle pandemics. But we have had to make decisions on certain medications, certain antiviral medications, certain anti-inflammatory medications like tocilizumab, which helps stop the cytokine storm in COVID. And we've had to make hard decisions on things like ECMO, which is the extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. There's only 3 centers in Ohio that have those machines, and there's not enough of them to go around. And unlike traditional ECMO, this is a tangent, you'll have to forgive me and get used to it. ECMO, most of our ECMO patients, and again, this is an artificial lung, basically. It's taking the blood out of the body, giving it oxygen, and putting it back in. In most of our history with ECMO, patients do very, very poorly because they're so sick. They have multi-organ failure. But in COVID, especially now with the Delta variant, where we have young COVID patients with respiratory failure, ECMO is very, very effective, and there's not enough ECMO machines to serve all the people that are sick. So there is an actual scarcity of that resource. There is an actual scarcity of some potentially life-saving and disease-modifying therapies. And there's a whole host of people with all kinds of other illnesses, including cancers, that are getting delayed care therapy because of the COVID pandemic. Okay. I do help with with not only with patient care, but also policy at the local, state, and federal level. So, just some general terms that I'll probably throw around during my tangents. One is, what is ethics? And in the title, I put ethos, and I did that for particular reasons. But the ethics, one could ask in your mind, how can an Orthodox Christian, who Father John Parker said is pious, which I would challenge, Father, but at least I long to be pious in the positive sense, but I'm afraid I fail commonly at that. How can an Orthodox Christian be the head of ethics at a secular public institution? One that has a disoriented anthropology, that doesn't follow the anthropos, that doesn't see Christ as the goal. How can that be so? And it's because ethics is done at different levels. And one is the procedural level, and that's the ethics that's established at law and public policy and professional standards. That's struggling within the profession to try to guide through medicine physicians and healthcare teams and families that are struggling at the bedside. That's a different type of ethics. It's a very thin ethics. It's not content rich. It doesn't have depth. But we also can teach in ethics and do scholarship in ethics at a foundational level. That is, from foundational philosophical religious views, that is more ultimately what we believe in. So for instance, at the Ohio State Wexner Medical Center, there may be faculty that don't agree in abortion. And thankfully, our center doesn't do elective abortions. But I don't have to do ethics at that level when I'm doing procedural ethics, but we can still talk about and consider the foundational ethics. And now, some people will make a distinction between ethics and something like ethos. The ethics is really about principles or a philosophy that guides right decision-making, the difference between good and bad, and the better or the beautiful. Ethos sometimes is more holistic, a holistic way of knowing. It's not just principle-based or philosophical-based, not always just rational. It's more. Now, it depends on which definition you have, right? It doesn't, we can use ethics and ethos in different ways. What we're trying to do is be followers of the way. So I'll use the terms interchangeably. I'm not going to be a stickler for those definitions. I'm now defining my terms. If I say ethics, think ethos or the Orthodox way. If I mean secular ethics standards, I'll say that. Otherwise, I ask for charity on the term. Now, if we think about ethics, we often will think about something this is in the context of a culture that is informed by the Protestant Reformation and a context that is informed by humanism, that we think that with Luther, if I'm not convinced by Holy Scripture and my own conscience, here I stand, I can do no other. Or the humanist would say, unless I'm convinced by my own conscience, here I stand, I can do no other. It's very individualistic. And in that ethics, it's an ethics that is post-Thomas Aquinas and post a whole scholasticism that tries to see a very clear black and white ethic, right and wrong, follow the morality, follow the inherent rightness or wrongness of an act, or follow its consequences. That's the moral tradition of of Western philosophical thought, is to try to make a clear distinction between right and wrong. And we do, within Orthodoxy, have right and wrong. Don't hear me wrongly. I'm not trying to further moral relativism in Orthodoxy. I'm just saying those very clean moral philosophical arguments fail to meet the messy reality of a fallen world. At lunch, we talked about a case of a woman who's dying in the hospital, and whether we should continue a woman who is dying in the hospital on advanced medical technologies. Regardless of what we do, she's going to die in days, short days to weeks. And the question is, now that we know that we can't bring healing and recovery, should we continue those technologies? Or should we stop those technologies and allow her to die? Now, I shared at lunch also that I think one of the best paragraphs of medical ethics is from St. Basil the Great's Long Rule 55. And this is a very bad paraphrase. I don't have it in front of me, so forgive me. It is something like, God gives us the gift of medicine for better life and longer life, and it can be used, doesn't have to be used, I think that's my reading, can be used until either the person becomes consumed by the disease or the treatment thereof, or the medicine is merely an encumbrance to one's death, which is really the birth pangs of true life. St. Ignatius. And so when we're faced in modern medical ethics dilemmas where we can't bring healing and recovery, the question may be, should we continue these therapies that are no longer helpful? And I think consistent with St. Basil, we can say we may cast medicine aside when those technologies are no longer helpful. But it hurts. If you're the priest at the bedside with that family and they're saying, Father, what should we do? Should we take our loved one off the ventilator and allow her to die? Or should we continue the ventilator knowing that she'd probably die in the next 5 days or 2 weeks? You're faced with two really horrible choices, two rotten choices. In many ways, you could think you're choosing the lesser of two evils. There may be a worse choice, and you're trying to make the best choice you can. In other ways, you could think we're facing the choice and there is no good and there may be no bad. We're just in a horrible situation. We're experiencing the reality of sin and reality of the fall. And we're experiencing suffering and death. So what do? We may try to trust in God and do the best we can as we stumble through the world that we're in. And if you continue the ventilator or you stop the ventilator, by God's mercy, we still may be saved. That on this spectrum of this tension within Orthodox ethos, there are antinomies or paradoxes. And we know this in theology. We're bound by sin, but we're also freed by Christ. In the way we live our life, these paradoxes or these antinomies, these edges, this tension, we also know that we have the way of monasticism and lifelong celibacy. We also have marriage. In our church, we also quibble over minor things, like we have head coverings and the unhead covered, or the long dresses versus the shorter ones, or the long beard versus the shorter beard, or the no beard. Oh. The way we live our life, there is a diversity on the Orthodox way. There are tensions. There's the way of a strict asceticism. There's also a way of living in the world that doesn't require as much of a strict asceticism. Now, there are continuities and discontinuities between those. They're on the same way, but they're not falling off into the ditches. And on that way of ethics, on one side, in the rigorous way, you will have the potential to fall off into the ditch of Pharisaism and prelest. On the other side, the more, charitable or compassionate or permissive way, you have the threat of falling into the ditch of antinomianism, that there is no law, that all things are permissible. And our job is to stay on that way. But also, if we start pointing fingers and saying, you're of the wrong medicine, You're of the naturopathy and the homeopathy and the traditional medicine, and you take vaccines and you don't. And we think that that is conflated with the faith. We fall off into that Pharisaism. We're creating a law above God, above what God requires. We're creating a law unto ourselves, and we actually are taught that we can't add superstitions and other laws to the faith. We know that's an error. Okay, so all that's a preamble of defining ethics. The idea of ethics is also in Orthodoxy is difficult because thankfully we don't have an ethics in that philosophical sense. There are things that we can clearly say are prohibited, some things that are proscribed and prescribed, but there are many things in between that will hold tension, and there are different ways on that path. All right. Next, another definition of sorts is who's in authority and who is an authority. I have admitted I'm not an authority in theology. I read church fathers, I read the lives of the saints, I attend church services. I'm an Orthodox Christian, and I'm giving you basically a narrative of an Orthodox Christian who's in medicine, who's thinking about the things of COVID and vaccines and dealing with them daily. But I'm not an authority on theology. In many ways, I'm not, even though I study moral theology, I'm not an authority in moral theology. I am an authority in medical ethics. I am an authority in medicine, certain aspects of medicine particularly. And thankfully, around COVID, I've been part of a healthcare treatment committee group that is around epidemiologists and infectious disease experts and vaccinologists, and they're very helpful in me being more sure about my own positions and how to assess the data. Now, bishops are authorities. They're an authority, one, in the sense that they're trained in theology, they know the faith, they know these things, but they're also in authority. And they have the authority in the diocese as the shepherd of their sheep. Priests have a type of authority that's given to them from the bishop that is giving spiritual guidance to their flock as well. I'm in authority in my own division, in my own center at the Ohio State. So the distinction between being an authority and in authority is an important one. If you want to ask medical questions and scientific questions, you go to a physician and you go to a scientist. And if you're going to assess whether that authority is a genuine authority, you use the methods and the understanding of that profession. And if that whole profession is saying that that person is to be questioned, or that scientific study is to be retracted and is not true, then that authority should be questioned. And if a theological authority starts saying things that are inconsistent with other Orthodox clergy and other Orthodox authorities, maybe they should be questioned as well. So the question of who's an authority and what is an authority is a distinction that may come up in our tangents as well. What I'd like to turn to now is more a consideration where I'm actually going to give an apology for kind of those who are against vaccines. If you want my take on why the vaccines are safe and effective, you can listen to the podcast, and I can answer questions on those too. And I'll say some comments along the way. I'm not neutral. I think the data is pretty clear, and I also know HEK cells, and it's not new to me. It's something that I've studied for the last 20 years, and many other voices that are commenting on these ethics dilemmas don't know medicine, and they don't know the ethics debates around things like tissue cell lines from aborted sources. They're new to it. And these are really hard topics, but they're not new topics. There's topics that Christian ethicists have dealt with for decades. And those that are really new to them are learning, and I'm afraid they're getting some things wrong, factually wrong. And I think some of the ethics assessments are wrong. Some of them are right, too, and we'll talk about, I think, some of the differing opinions along the way. But I am going to give some sympathy to those that are struggling with this new information. We're in a chaotic world. And the goal of my talk, again, isn't to convince people of vaccines or not. It's to convince people that maybe we should be charitable to one another and rejoice that we have the mercy of God. Not that we should take it for granted, but rejoice that perhaps he'll have mercy on us. If I think about the COVID skeptic, as I've engaged many COVID skeptic people, COVID skepticism being defined as those that may think that the COVID isn't as bad as the media portrayed and such as that, or that it's just the flu, or that something's exaggerated, and then vaccine hesitant, which means people that don't want a vaccine. There is a distinction that could be made between vaccine hesitant and anti-vax. I think those are those that their vaccine hesitance may be a fear or reluctance to have vaccine. Anti-vax is really a movement that thinks that's wrapped in a lot of other things, and I'll mention some of that along the way. So if we think about COVID skepticism and vaccine hesitance, there's a diversity of concerns. It is wrong for us to think that all the concerns are the same. We need to be honest if you're going to engage people. For those of you that are saying, I have a family member who he just boils down the whole debate to, why are you even talking about COVID vaccines? If you get vaccinated, it's right. If you don't get vaccinated, you're just stupid. That's how he boils it down. And I have to say, well, that's not exactly right. Actually, that's not honest. And we want to have an honest discussion if we're going to, especially as brothers and sisters in Christ, we need to be charitable of one another. I can point out that the vaccine hesitance numbers at one point in time, and data changes. Science is contingent, right? Data changes. This is a hard part, especially for those that study eternal truths that shouldn't change, and if they do change, if you have an original thought, beware. You're probably wrong. But on scientific truths, it's contingent. It depends on the data, okay? So at one point in time, the data showed that vaccine hesitance was actually bimodal. It had one mode, one peak in uneducated people that had basic mistrusts. These may be some particular populations that were either newly immigrants or other socially disenfranchised groups, are one large proportion of vaccine hesitance. The others were PhDs. They're at least smart enough to be a PhD, but they are vaccine hesitant. So I don't think it's enough to say they're stupid. No, that's not right. There are smart people that are concerned with vaccine, and their concerns differ quite a bit. Okay, one of the reasons. Well, I'll get to that later. So one reason could be that there's scientific uncertainty. This has all happened so fast, and we don't have the kind of scientific precision and certainty that we normally have with kinds of questions. Or so it could be that the vaccines were developed so fast. Normally, a vaccine is developed over 6 to 15 years, which is true. And therefore, I'm hesitant of this vaccine because it was developed over a year. Sure, yeah. There may be risks that we wouldn't know. Any sober scientist that, there was just the head of the Center for Infectious Disease at University of Minnesota was just interviewed about booster shots, booster vaccines. And his first 5 answers to the reporter who asked a simple question about boosters were, we don't know this, we don't know this, we don't know this, we don't know this, and we don't know this. A sober scientist is going to start by showing the limit of his knowledge, to know his finitude and the finitude of the information that's given. When people start by saying, we know this, especially if they're not trained to say that we know this, beware. They may be speaking beyond their actual expertise, and they may be not aware of their own fallibility, their own finitude in knowledge, especially. So a good sober scientist is going to start with uncertainty. The question is this calculation of how certain do you need to be before acting? It's a risk assessment, right? If you're at a bridge and there's a giant chasm, a very dangerous chasm, and you have a bridge and it doesn't look like a great bridge. It's a sketchy bridge. And you're the only person and you have to go across the bridge and there's a giant chasm there. You may want to test the bridge first. If a lion's behind you and is about to pounce on you, you'll probably take the rickety bridge, right? That lion would be if you have a pandemic and you think you're going to die. Now, people have different risk perceptions over whether they're going to die from the pandemic. If you're making decisions on whether people should stay on a ventilator or not, or you're talking to a 32-year-old recent postpartum woman, and she's awake and she can't recover from her lung disease, and you're having to talk to her about who gets her child after she dies because she's not going to survive the hospital stay. If you're an ICU nurse or an ER nurse, you may have a high risk perception. And you may get really burned out if what you hear on the news or what you hear from friends at church is that you're part of a heartless conspiracy that's only about money, when you're risking your life and you're giving your heart every day. But risk assessment, if you think there's a lion coming after you, you'll go across that rickety bridge. You'll take that risk calculation. And then if you've seen 100 people go across that rickety bridge, even without a lion, you may go. And if you have a lion behind you and you have 100 people go before you, maybe you go across the rickety bridge. But it'd be wrong to say it looks like a great bridge. It's not the bridge that you want it to be. So the head of the Center for Infectious Disease at the University of Minnesota starts by that. He starts by saying, all of these are the questions we would know if we had 10 years to study it, but we don't have 10 years. And here's what I think. That's a sober scientific response. Okay. Point 2. I may need more time, Father. Some people that are vaccine hesitant and COVID skeptic have challenges of liberty and privacy. And these are real concerns. We see beyond COVID, we see a challenge of liberty and privacy, from religious liberty and infringements upon that, and encroachments in privacy. One of the greatest encroachments in privacy may be the phone in your pocket, not the nanochip that was injected in your arm, which doesn't exist. But concerns of liberty, privacy are concerns. Now, in the vaccine, what I said in one of the podcasts, regardless of your view on mandates, it'd be wrong to say mandates are a new communist or neo-fascist order, since vaccine mandates have been around in U.S. law since the 19th century. And they've been affirmed again and again and again in the courts, because classic liberty, kind of humanist classical liberalism, says that your liberty may be limited by the liberty of others. And in a time of great infection, in epidemic, pandemic, some of those liberties can be curtailed for the protection of the public. Whether those liberties and how they're curtailed is warranted depends on the particular circumstance. Someone asked me how a student who's unvaccinated should be treated in a learning institution, like an Orthodox learning institution. And I tried to give an answer, but the answer is contingent. If your numbers of Delta COVID go down, then maybe it's with great freedom. If your numbers of a vaccine responsive variant go up and the vaccine is the only effective treatment and you're seeing people get really sick, maybe you're more curtailed. If a new variant comes along that the vaccine's not effective to, maybe it doesn't matter. The kinds of curtailing of our liberties should, if it's related honestly to public health concerns and infection, should be related to the precise issue. Our health care center at Ohio State has a vaccine mandate with religious exemptions, which are hard to come by. When you have a Roman Catholic who says, I want a religious exemption, but the Pope says it's a moral duty to have a vaccine, that's a hard one. I think it's difficult for Orthodox too. It may not be impossible, but it's pretty difficult, since most have said there's not a religious encumbrance to having a vaccine. And yes, we know what HEK cells, and yes, we know where they come from, and no, they're not pure, and yes, there's a problem with them. I wish they didn't exist, okay? But our OSU policy allows for religious exemption, allows for philosophical exemption, allows for medical exemption. And if you don't have a vaccine, you have to wear a mask, which everybody has to wear one right now, and you have to have a weekly COVID test, which isn't horrible. Now, I could imagine that changing if things got worse. And under the current policy, if things get better, you don't have to wear a mask anymore. You don't have to have COVID tests anymore. So the curtailing of liberty is not forever and always. Kind of like bishops saying, maybe after I've consulted authorities in medicine, authorities in other areas, we're going to ask that you wear a mask in church. This is not iconoclasm. We bear the image of God, and our face is important. It means something. Having liberty means something. Having the image of God before you, having the face before you is important. But they're not saying this is idolatry and you must tear this face down. They're not saying that. Give them charity. If they say we're not going to have services at this parish because we had a COVID outbreak and we need to wait 2 weeks, it's not violating a commandment. It's being wise. So a concern of liberty and privacy is valid, but liberty and privacy being curtailed should be based upon the circumstance at hand. When that liberty and privacy, which we should watch for this, extends beyond that which is necessary, that's when we need to be very watchful and careful. When that happens, there's going to be, some people think it's already been there, others, but we must be vigilant on that as well. Other COVID skeptic and vaccine hesitant may have had personal experience of perceived harm from medicine or from the vaccines. I've gotten forwarded to me from a particular priest cases of those who have been harmed that he knows from the vaccine. And one of them, I actually could say, that's false. Where I heard from a parishioner that someone died from the vaccine a couple of weeks after he got the vaccine. And I know that's not true. I'm not going to tell you what he died from, but it wasn't from that. Nothing close. And people saw that there was a proximity in time between the vaccine and a sudden death, and they assumed it's from the vaccine. But with a great deal of certainty, I can tell you, it wasn't. And that's kind of a microcosm of many of the vaccine stories. If people die every day, people get sick and go to the hospital every day. And if you have a vaccine potential causing an adverse event, it has to be put to the test. Not because it's not believed. I mean, look, the VAERS reporting people and the CDC and the FDA people, I know these people. They are not demonic shills for industry. There are people taking this very seriously and poring over data, and they want to catch something if there's a problem. They want to catch it quickly so they don't have to lose themselves because people were hurt under their watch. If you know the history of vaccines and medicine, the people that develop and further medicines and even vaccines that hurt people often end in suicide. And really, the number of suicides for people that in the history in the 20th century that it ended up that their medicine hurt something, it destroys them. So the scientists, again, behind a lot of these government agencies and regulations, I know them. Some of them are Orthodox Christians, by the way. Some of them are God-fearing Christians. And they take their jobs very seriously. They are a safety net, and a safety net that is needed and has been shown to be needed over time because of medical challenges through other vaccines and other medications, okay? So I say a perceived harm from previous medicine. Sometimes medicines do harm people. Sometimes there are horrible, tragic cases. When the polio vaccine the Salk vaccine was first developed in 1955, there was a lab, Cutter Labs, that didn't follow all the safety precautions, and thousands contracted polio from the vaccine, and several died. And it was caught. And after that, and even when Wyeth was upscaling, mass-producing the vaccine, they had some problems in quality control because when they were using a larger vat, they didn't realize some things would congeal at the bottom and some of the virus wouldn't be killed, and this was a killed virus vaccine. And some people were hurt. And because some people were hurt, and the vaccine really did hurt people, several deaths, thousands got polio, and many paralyzed. Really tragic. And there were greater safety precautions put in place because of that. And even with those tragedies, if you look back at a population level, you're much better off getting the polio vaccine those years than you were not. But it doesn't mean that, so some people really are harmed by vaccines and medicine, but sometimes it's a perceived harm. And it actually is a role of a lot of really careful scientists and professionals to try to figure that out. There are concerns about profit-driven policy, that pharma's just in it for the money. Pharma makes a lot of money. But there are a lot of profit-driven industries that people are unaware of. There is an anti-vaccine industry, people that make millions and millions of dollars off of furthering anti-vaccine propaganda. Most people that are commenting on the web from Orthodox positions are completely unaware of this. There's a giant supplement industry that exploded after 1992, and all the supplement regulations from by the FDA were basically abandoned. And they were abandoned because the supplement industry got together and paid lobbying groups and contributed to politicians, and they beat pharma. If pharma is this superpower that always gets its way and has control over everything, how did they win that one? Huge political, and it's over a $40 billion industry. We're not talking change here. I mean, it's a big industry. And pharma's in the supplement industry now. One big pharmaceutical is one of the greatest producers of vitamin C. So the profit-driven concern, yes, we should be concerned about greed and profit and selfishness, but it's kind of an equal opportunity sin. Not that profit is sin, but the greed around it is. So then there's unfounded theories and concerns. Some people are anti-vax and COVID skeptic because of conspiracy theories that are, as you know, I've heard everything from luciferase is in it. This is from Lucifer himself. Luciferase is the enzyme that makes lightning plugs glow, and it's used as something that makes in lab tests to make things light up. Has nothing to do with Satan, and it's not in the vaccine. And I could go through a whole list of these, including Bill Gates being the Marvel character Thanos wanting to depopulate the earth, or nanoprobes being injected in your arm. All these, there are a lot of conspiracy theories, but many people that are vaccine hesitant or COVID skeptic are not engrossed in conspiracy theories. Some of them become that way as they're pushed that way because people are not listening to them and they finally found their group. And others are vaccine hesitant or COVID skeptic based on moral or ethical grounds. The concerns mainly about aborted tissues being used. As a context, we have to understand that we have unprecedented mistrust in our legacy institutions in the modern era. Now that we've always had some mistrust, and if you study history, it may be actually an overstatement that we have unprecedented mistrust. Like people say politics is worse than it ever has been. Well, we had a war between states where we killed a whole lot of people. And at one point in time, politicians did shoot at each other in duels. And there used to be spittoons and fights breaking out in Congress. That hasn't happened in a while, but I think it feels to us that it's unprecedented. But maybe it's because we're historically arrogant and we think that we're at a different place than humans were throughout history. So there's continuity, there's discontinuity. I will say that it seems that there's less trust in medicine. Okay? Currently, especially it seems in my lifetime, there's more mistrust in government. I imagine sometimes if C. Everett Koop were to go in front of the nation and tell the people about COVID and this epidemic and pandemic and the treatments, perhaps he would have been trusted more in that era. Maybe it's because of who he was, a man of integrity. Maybe it's the circumstance. But there seems to be more mistrust of government. Legacy institutions like the CDC and the AMA. And in some ways, you can understand why, especially for Orthodox Christians. The CDC, it brought you lockdowns, it brought you other things, but they also seem to maybe dabble every now and then in things they shouldn't dabble in, like or even legacy journals like The Lancet, which sometimes doesn't seem like it can distinguish a man from a woman, those with a uterus or a cervix. I mean, if you have a medical journal that can't make that distinction between biological male and female, or seems to be furthering a political or ethical agenda that's antithetical to orthodoxy, maybe there's earned mistrust. But maybe it should be compartmentalized. That there are some things that are being furthered politically and ethically, but other things may be far more accurate. Maybe the CDC was maybe overstepped a bit with lockdowns, but maybe they're right in therapeutics. Maybe they're right with vaccines. There's mistrust in the media, there's mistrust in medicine, and one of the poll after poll shows that one of the most mistrusted industries in the world is pharma, although they bring you medicines that save lives every day. It's a paradox, it's an antinomy. Do I tell you to trust pharma and say that pharma's always done all things righteous? No, of course not. I've testified against pharma. I've also prescribed their drugs to save patients' lives. It's a paradox. There's politicization. I mean, it's more political. Everything's becoming political. Why is medicine political? Medicine's been political for some time. We think about, like, the rise of supplements and alternative medicine as mainly first being kind of a left of center political movement, but the John Birch Society, a right-leaning group, a right libertarian group, helped support one of the greatest cancer hoaxes of the 1970s, a medicine that didn't work at all, and people lost their lives. They did the name of liberty and the great pharma conspiracy that was hiding the real treatment that no one was realizing. It was the great cover-up. It's one of the longest-lived conspiracy theories. And it was furthered on the right in the 1970s. It's not a completely new thing. Okay? I'm not saying that they mean that people, so hear me clearly, when I say conspiracy theory, I'm not saying that people are intentionally furthering it. I'm just saying it is something that's been said time and time again, and it's been across the political spectrum, both usually on the right and the left, not in the middle as much. Okay? And so things have been political for some time. We also are in the context of great democratization of content. And like I said, in the backdrop of a society that's informed by the Protestant Reformation, a society that is not based on hierarchy, a society that is informed by humanism, we think that we actually have the individualistic ability to take on any topic and know it, even if it's only in a couple of hours reading a couple of sites on the internet or watching a YouTube by someone who seems smarter than us. And we think we can become an authority. I was dealing with one clergy member who he wanted to write something, and I kept saying, well, what are you writing on? What are you writing on? And he wanted to write on epidemiology, and he wasn't trained in epidemiology. Really smart man, pious man, Orthodox Christian. I'm not saying that he's not an Orthodox Christian. I'm not saying that it's not smart. I'm saying he doesn't know anything about epidemiology, and he's not going to learn it in a year to be able to deal with one of the most complex epidemiological crises that we've seen in a lifetime. Same thing goes with vaccines. If you think you're going to figure it out better than a vaccinologist that's studied it for the last 25 years, you're not. So we have this democratization of content, and things have been boosted by social media and alternative media, that you can find people that agree with you. When we're faced with chaos and fear is the greatest motivator that we have of humans. If you want to manipulate humans, make them very, very afraid. And if the COVID experience has taught us anything, is that is true. There's been exaggerations and fear-mongering on both sides. They have that in common. But when you're faced with fear, you want to make sense of that fear. You want to find a tribe around that fear. You even want to find a guru who may be able to direct your life and know about the fear greater than you, and be able to tell you something that you should do in your life or give you a direction that directs your life better, because you can't figure it out. You're afraid. You don't know how to act, so you find people that can tell you how to act and what to believe, this is a paradox. It's an antinomy. Because of the reason you're looking for that really exotic guru who's thinking thoughts that the mainstream people aren't is because your rugged individualism and you becoming an expert has told you you need it. And then you find community of other people that share some of your beliefs, and social media means that you find more than 2 people that are in your community, and you'll finally burn out because you're tired of meeting each other and you find areas you disagree with. You can find a group of a couple of thousand around the world that really agree with you. And all of a sudden you have a tribe. And then you find a couple of scientists that have credentials, or a physician that lost his position at a major medical center and has been sued to never mention those medical centers he used to work for. And all of a sudden you have your guru who can explain it all and give you the direction. And we do this in Orthodoxy too. We want people that can tell us what's needed in our life. I mean, there's a temptation not just to have a spiritual father that helps you know yourself, in a reciprocal relationship of love can help you know yourself and guide you in a spiritual path. There's a temptation to have an oppressive, obedience-driven demagogue who pretends he knows you better than you and knows the way that only he can tell you. There's a parallel. It's not exact, but it is a temptation. And in this time, people are afraid, and they want to make sense of chaos. So they try to find the narrative. And it's not very appealing when you get a scientist who says, well, this is what we don't know, and this is what we don't know, and this is what we don't know, but this is what I think. Or if you ask me an ethics question, I say, well, do you have the next 2 hours? And maybe I'll start to get at it. Instead, they want the person that says, this is what's causing it. Your boogeyman is pharma, and here's your tribe, and we're going to save things because we're going to let people know about the boogeyman. And that is a need as humans. And so those of you who are saying I'm trying to defend the COVID hesitant and vaccine hesitant, or the COVID skeptic, are now saying I seem to be bashing them. But that's a human drive. And as future priests, you should know this, or as priests, you can say this. We all have that drive to make sense out of chaos. Sometimes that drive can be made holy. We turn to Christ. We turn to the church to show us the true beauty and structure out of the chaos, the true creation, the ultimate eschaton that is the sense made out of chaos. But we have little false stories along the way that we'll encounter that we have to deal with, unfortunately, because of our fallibility and our fallenness. So further on the context, I'll just say that we've had a huge rise, especially since 1992, of naturopathic, homeopathic, alternative medicines among the religious and conservative, which is somewhat unique, but not completely. Now, I'll say this really quickly. I think there's only one type of medicine that works and medicine that doesn't. If you have alternative medicine or naturopathic medicine that works, it's called medicine. That said, my belief in medicine is not tied to mine or your salvation. We do not venerate. My baptismal name is Samson, after Samson the Hospitable, a great unmercenary physician saint. Saint Samson is not a saint because of the Galenic medicine he practiced. If I were given a book from Saint Samson that taught me how to treat certain ailments with Galenic medicine, I wouldn't say, oh, I have a holy book. I may be holy because of a secondary relic, but I have a holy book, and I'm now going to practice Galenic medicine. No, I'd have to put that medicine to the test and see if it actually works, which most of it doesn't. So I would have to say, well, this isn't it. This isn't why Saint Samson is a saint. If he healed with Galenic medicine, great. It's just it's not what we think is effective now. If he healed with holy miracle and fervent prayer and piety, and you gave me a book of Saint Samson's prayer rule, I would ask Vladika for a blessing to follow that prayer rule if I thought I could handle it, which maybe someone would have to tell me, you're probably not holy enough, pious enough. You're not able, because I'm sure Saint Samson had a much greater burden than I can bear. So our unmercenary physician saints are not saints because of the medicine they practiced. And if someone in your parish believes in homeopathy, which is a tincture of something that you start with a chemical and you dilute it so much that the chemical's not there anymore, and then they take it because it has changed the water within it. It has the essence of the chemical without having the chemical, and it works, even though it doesn't work beyond placebo and it doesn't work at all. But if they believe in homeopathy, so be it. They can still be saved. They can still have the blessing of the church and the mercy of the church and all those things. Your view of medicine does not change your opportunity to receive the mercy of God. Okay. There's also a context of, unfortunately, in polarized times, that the enemy of our enemy is our friend. So if someone says something that sounds conservative politically, and you're conservative politically, and you're an Orthodox Christian, and they say something that's against something you're against, you think maybe they're right. Because you look at the source. If someone's politically conservative and all of a sudden they're anti-vax, then you buy into it. That's a challenge. The enemy of our enemy is not our friend. Why should we anticipate any friends other than the friends of Christ? Yeah, I'll move on. So other contexts, again, defending those who have hesitance. People of faith are greatly disenfranchised. And politically, those who lean right of center or Republican, they notice that and care about liberty. They know that their liberties have been infringed upon on many things. There's also we're in a Marcusian revolution, cultural revolution, where sexual mores and religious mores and all kinds of societal challenges are hitting us. And I'm not debating that. Those are true. I mean, there's a real problem out there. Times are dark. And if you have seemingly institutions that are furthering things that are antithetical to your positions, it's easy to think they're the enemy. And your position is no longer tolerated. This is hard. And if they seem to be furthering things around COVID and vaccines, and you're just looking at the source, it seems rational to not trust them. I'm not telling you to trust them on that, on all things. I'm saying try to be particular on what you're trusting and not trusting. Don't think things are all good or all bad. Within the vaccines, for instance, it looked like pharma was against President Trump. It looked like, at the beginning of COVID, politically, it was all over the place. Sometimes it was a big, horrible thing coming, and sometimes it wasn't. And who was saying what politically, it was all over the place. And then there was, Trump was in the summer saying, we're going to have a vaccine before the election, triumphantly. And even he was aware of some of the very early release of data saying that they looked like they were going to work. And then Pfizer and Moderna seemed to just withhold the information right before the election. And it was announced a week after the election that the vaccines were very effective, and the market went up, and everyone rejoiced that there was vaccines that President Trump was promising and wanted. And it seemed like pharma had undermined all of this. I don't know how true it is, but it does seem that way. I don't know if that's true. There's never been really credible reasons why they withheld data. But to those who are seeing a political movement and feel disenfranchised, this was one more reason to mistrust pharma. That's a rational mistrust. I don't know how accurate it is. But I also have to point out, Trump was for the vaccines. And though the vaccines may have been a tool, I don't know if they were, if the vaccines, the information were a tool around that political movement, it doesn't mean that the tool itself is bad, right? So that's a challenge. So some of the mistrust that people have towards certain institution is earned. Some of the mistrust that they have towards certain institution is exaggerated. And so this is some of the, and we live in a time where personal attacks replace facts. And we have media sensationalism and bias everywhere. It's very hard to get sober news. Students ask me all the time, what sources should I use? I'm like, I don't know. If you want sources on medicine, I would turn to things such as the CDC, which I think on treatment of COVID is actually quite sober. There's a group by McMaster University that follows, and SciTech, which can show you all the clinical trials. If you think you can understand clinical trials and you want to see them all and not just what's in that, you could look there. The University of Minnesota Center for Infectious Disease, the Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania, the CHOP, Center for Vaccine Education, all those are very good sites that I think are trustworthy. So I just got started, Father, I'm sorry. Okay, so some of the claims, I won't go through all the claims. You can hear me on those things later. So what are the, let's talk about just the ethical considerations. I'm going to give two poles, and I'll try to give you something in between. Early on, there were groups, including the Orthodox Theological Society of America, that gave a clear claim that something like vaccines are very safe and effective and permissible. And if you will, they could be accused of doing what seemed to be answering a Christian consequentialist kind of view. Because it doesn't cause any new abortions and it can do a great deal of good, we're just going to say you can do it. But they didn't go into a lot of detail, and they did make a lot of theological commentary. And so they've been accused of maybe making a kind of a consequentialist argument. On the other side, you have people that are saying these are wrong, because they have something to do with abortion. And they're using a lens of just pro-life as a consistent moral philosophy for all things. And because they were related to abortion, they're saying wrong, or they're saying the mark of the beast or something like this. And if they're, I'm not making an argument about holy perception. I'm not holy, I'm just doing ethics, okay? The truth is somewhere in between. I think the folks that make the so-called Christian consequentialists actually know this. And I explained this in the podcast, and I won't go in great depth here, but the reality is somewhere in between, that they are tainted. Yeah, they were, HEK cells were used in the research, not in the production, for Pfizer and Moderna. There's no cells in them. And even in the other there's no cells, no aborted baby cells in them, even if it was grown on them, which some of, like the Sputnik and other viruses are, other vaccines are. But somewhere in between these poles is the truth. Can I tell you? So I'm complicated, because if someone asked me, is it ethically permissible to receive a vaccine, I'd say yes, but it depends on how you ask the question. Yes, it's ethically permissible for you to receive the vaccine. I think that's clear, and bishops have made that clear. Many priests have made that clear. Many holy elders that aren't on the anti-vax COVID sites have also made that very clear. There's a selectivity bias, but if you ask me, is it without sin? Oh, I can't say that. Because I do know that it has this relationship to this abortion in the past. And I've actually been for years, I've been part of a group that wanted to eliminate HEK cells. We think that there's better alternatives. And I'm still for HEK cell use to stop. And hopefully that may be a good outcome of this COVID issue, is that we will have more leverage to say, look, there's a large portion of society that cannot tolerate things tested on HEK cells. Now, you can make an argument why HEK cells could be used, that this is what man can, and intended for evil, God has used for good, but I think that's too superficial of an argument. I think if we're a people that know there's tangibility, we venerate relics. We know there's holy places, there's cursed places, there's something that's tangible, and we can't simply say that matter doesn't matter. And those cells that were from that abortion should be treated with dignity and respect. Okay? And we should find other alternatives. I think we can agree there. But then we have to also realize that the HEK cell use is not unique to the vaccines. It's on almost every medicine has been tested on them, most diagnostic tests, and a lot of cosmetics, a lot of food flavors, and other things. If you want to know how a chemical reacts to human tissue, you use a human tissue culture to find that out. And the second most common human tissue culture used in all of science are HEK cell lines. Number one's HeLa, which is not from abortion, something different. Very interesting ethical story, but it's different. So the problem is it's really complex. Am I able to say it's without sin? No. It's tainted. But so is most everything that we deal with in a fallen world. That doesn't mean we fall into antinomianism. Therefore, it doesn't matter. No, we do the best we can to distance ourselves from sin. But every time you engage in purchasing something from a store, you're letting a group profit that may be furthering agendas that are antithetical to orthodoxy. Every time you further other, I cover this some in the podcast, so I won't recapitulate some of this, but we engage in a fallen world, and we're engaging in a world tainted with sin and the reality of the fall. This reality of sin is real, and when you hear people talk about very black and white ethics, they're using an ethic that should be foreign to orthodoxy. And then if they're conflating it with the faith, it's even more of a challenge. So quickly, what's my advice? How can we move forward from this? These are just some guidance of what can we do. One, I think we want to engage people with charity, which means don't drop H-bombs. Heretic. If you think that this is one of the heresies that an ecumenical council needs to be called for, ask to call for one. But if this is all heresy, don't use the term outside of its context. So avoid H-bombs. And if you're tuning into podcasts or YouTubes or other things where everyone's trying to make the drop H-bombs, maybe you shouldn't send them money. Maybe you shouldn't tune into them. And when you're in one-on-one dialogue, if they're trying to make things very, very clear and everything's about heresy, how about let's be specific with that term? So beware of the H-bomb. Try to have charity. Assume the best of other people. If they're brothers and sisters in Christ, how about learn about them first? What are their concerns? Assume the best. Don't assume that your bishops don't want to worship or that they're trying to change the church. Ask them what their concerns are. They're actually consulting authorities in those things. You may disagree with them, and you can state maybe you can disagree with them through the proper channels, but assume the best of people. Then have some reality testing. When your brothers and sisters believe something that you know to be untrue, in a charitable way, maybe find out together why it's not or is true. Until you reach a certain point when people want to fight, there's no reason to fight. They won't believe. It's much like the way we share the faith. If people ask and they want to engage, we share. If they want to fight, and there are some people that are professional fighters, we don't need to fight with them. So, and then in your own mind, if you find something and you have confirmed from good sources, trusted sources, then one of the big ones, and I'll end with this, and I have several other things, and I apologize for rambling on and on, is find something better to do with your time. I mean, the amount of time, I've received emails after the podcast that are so vicious and took so much time to construct that all of that effort could have gone to really change people's life for the better and made all kinds of assumptions about me that are completely untrue, really uncharitable. St. Paisios, he's been popular in these debates, says he has this understanding of the reality of sin, that there are many ways to sin, voluntary, involuntary, known and unknown, knowledge and ignorance. We talked about some of this in our lunchtime. But he says, focus on the volitional sin. That's what will answer for the most. Sin is sin. But work on yourself, improve yourself, and find something better to do with your time to further your prayers, to further your piety, to further your love of others, to feed the poor, to clothe the naked, to care for your fellow man. We could change the world if we would put much energy, all this nervous fear, and we could direct it to the real truth, the real structure and beauty that takes the chaos and fear and gives us communion with God through the Holy Church. That's what we need to further. Yes, we need to pray together. Yes, we need to worship together. All of us want that. And we should do everything we can to get that. We may have mitigation strategies and we may have encumbrances and it may be messy, but our job is to kind of bungle our way through this fallen world to try to reach communion with God as best we can. And as much as we're trying to orient our lives and our soul to God, even if we bungle and fall short, we're not in sin in the greatest way, as long as we're directed and oriented to God in a real way. If we are directing and orienting our soul to God, things will, in calling upon God's mercy again and again, these taints of sin, these taints of things like HEK cells are washed away with God's mercy. Through our morning and evening prayers, our partaking of holy water and Antinomies, through the Holy Unction service, through the great blessing of the Holy Eucharist, we're cleansed by God's mercy. May we make ourselves worthy. And please, let's stop backbiting and attacking our brothers and sisters. Thank you for listening, and I guess we can go to Q&A.
Time to manage for the sake
I'm asked to repeat all questions for